Welcome back to the deep dive, where we kind of dig into those complex ideas and really try to extract those hidden gems of knowledge, those little nuggets.
Yeah. Yeah.
So today we're diving into chapter 9 of James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State.
Okay.
And it's called Thin Simplifications and Practical Knowledge.
Hmm.
And we're going to explore how these grand schemes for improving the human condition, often kind of go astray.
Yeah.
And we'll uncover how this idea of melimus, that practical localized knowledge that we talked about so often, is often kind of sidelined in the pursuit of these grand, these sweeping plans.
Right. Yeah. Scott's work is so insightful, especially for folks like us, who are fascinated by how cities actually work, right? Those intricacies of urban environments.
Yeah.
And he really argues that, planners and those in power often fall prey to what he calls, these thin simplifications, and they reduce the messy realities of life to these neat, manageable models.
So it's like they're trying to, fit a square peg in a round hole,
Totally.
They're trying to impose order on something that's inherently organic and complex.
Yeah, exactly. And Scott, illustrates this so well with, the example of scientific forestry.
Okay.
Back in 18th and 19th century Europe, states became just totally obsessed with maximizing timber yields, right? So they plant these, vast monoculture forests, just rows and rows of the same trees, all the same age.
Wow.
On paper, it seemed like brilliantly efficient.
It's like they were treating a forest like a giant spreadsheet.
Exactly.
Optimizing, just for a single variable timber output.
Exactly right.
Wow.
But, what they missed was that intricate web of relationships, that exists within a forest ecosystem.
Right.
The biodiversity, the undergrowth, the decaying wood, all that messy stuff.
Yeah.
That actually makes a forest resilient. So these scientific forests, they ended up being incredibly vulnerable to disease, pests,
Oh, wow.
even fire. So ironically, they had to start reintroducing complexity, like mimicking those pre-scientific forests to actually make these things work.
Wow. So that's a real cautionary tale for anybody who's, trying to design or manage a complex system.
Totally.
Especially, for our urban planning enthusiasts out there.
Absolutely. And that's where the parallel to urban planning, I think, is so striking.
Yeah.
You think of these grand modernist visions of cities like Le Corbusier's plans, with towering concrete blocks, wide open plazas, very strict separation of functions,
Right.
These were scientific cities.
Yeah.
They were aiming for efficiency and order, but often they just ended up feeling sterile and isolating.
It's so interesting because, those vast open spaces, were meant to foster a sense of community.
Right.
But often they had the opposite effect.
Yeah.
It felt impersonal and even a little bit intimidating.
Totally. And a prime example is Brasilia. Brazil's meticulously planned capital city. While it's, architecturally impressive, it initially just really struggled to create that, vibrant, lived-in feel. Residents felt really disconnected in these grand, impersonal spaces. And it's ironic because Brasilia, eventually became livable, precisely because people started subverting the rigid plan.
Oh, wow.
They created those informal settlements and markets and gathering spaces that injected, that much-needed dose of human-scale complexity.
So the city had to evolve organically.
Exactly.
Almost in defiance of the original plan to truly function as a living, breathing community.
Precisely. And this is where Scott's concept of Metis comes into play.
Great.
He argues that alongside this formal scientific knowledge, there exists, this vital form of practical localized knowledge, what the Greeks called metisis. And it's really about knowing how to do things in a specific context,
Right.
based on experience, observation, and a feel for the situation.
So it's like an intuition that's honed by years of experience.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Think about Squanto, the Native American who advised the Pilgrims to plant maize when the oak leaves were the size of a squirrel's ear.
Oh, wow.
It's incredibly specific, locally relevant advice. You wouldn't find that in an agricultural manual,
Right.
That's Metis in action, understanding, those subtle cues of the environment and adapting accordingly.
So valuable.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with, complex systems like a forest or a city.
Absolutely. One of Scott's key points is that Metis is really difficult to codify or
Okay.
teach in a traditional sense.
Right.
It's acquired through practice, through trial and error, through being embedded in a particular context.
So it's like the difference between reading about riding a bike and actually getting on one and figuring it out.
Exactly. And just
Yeah.
like riding a bike, Metis is everywhere once you start looking for it. From, the way a skilled craftsperson knows just the right amount of pressure to apply to, the way a seasoned politician navigates those, intricacies of political negotiations.
Right.
Metis is constantly at play.
So it's not just about practical skills.
Right.
It's about understanding those nuances of social interactions and
Yeah.
cultural norms and power dynamics.
Precisely. And, this brings us to a fascinating tension that Scott identifies.
Okay.
And it's the tension between Metis,
Uh-huh.
this practical knowledge rooted in experience,
Yeah.
and epistemes and techne, the Greek terms for formalized scientific knowledge and practical skills based on those, general principles.
Okay, so we've got Metis on the one side representing, the more formalized experiential knowledge,
Right.
and episteme and techne on the other side,
Yeah.
representing, the more formalized and codified forms of knowledge and skills.
Exactly. And Western thought, particularly since the Enlightenment, has really prioritized episteme, that pursuit of universal, timeless truths.
Yeah.
And while, techne acknowledges practical skills, it often focuses on those codified procedures and principles rather than that nuanced, context-specific understanding of Metis.
Right.
And Scott argues that, this emphasis on formal knowledge systems has often led to, a devaluation, even a dismissal of Metis.
So it's almost like we've created this hierarchy of knowledge
Yeah.
where, abstract theoretical knowledge is seen as superior to the practical wisdom of experience.
That's a great way to put it. And, this has real consequences,
Right.
especially when it comes to, designing and managing complex systems.
This makes me think about how we approach urban planning.
Right.
Are we giving enough weight to the Metis of the people who actually live and work in these environments?
Yeah.
Or are we too focused on applying, abstract theories and models?
That's a crucial question, and it's something we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Right.
We'll really delve into how that erosion of metal days can have these, detrimental effects, and how we might start designing institutions that are more metal days friendly.
Well, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm really eager to explore how we can kind of shift our thinking to better value and incorporate this vital form of knowledge.
Yeah.
But for now, let's take a moment to reflect on, the ideas we've covered so far.
Okay.
We've explored how thin simplifications can backfire, how Metis offers, a different way of knowing, and how this tension between different forms of knowledge plays out in the real world.
Yeah.
What are some of the key takeaways that are resonating with you?
Well, I think one of the things that really strikes me is how often we overlook that practical wisdom, right?
Yeah.
Before the break, we were talking about that tension between those formal knowledge systems and Neldides, that practical, localized knowledge that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
And Scott argues that, this oversight can have some serious consequences, especially, in fields like urban planning.
It's interesting because, we often think of a progress, in terms of these grand plans and technological solutions.
Right.
But what if we're missing out on, a wealth of knowledge and wisdom that's already there embedded within our communities?
Yeah, that's a key point. You
Yeah.
know, and Scott, he provides this really compelling anecdote
Okay.
about a Malaysian villager named Mat Isa
Okay.
who faced this red ant infestation in his mango tree. And instead of reaching for, a chemical pesticide,
Right.
Mat Isa, drawing upon, his deep understanding of the local ecosystem,
Yeah.
he observes that black ants were the natural enemies of red ants.
So he basically engineered an ant war to save his mango crop.
Exactly. He
Yeah.
figured out how to attract black ants to the mango tree,
Wow.
and they successfully drove out the red ants.
That's amazing.
And this solution, rooted in Mat Isa's Metis,
yeah.
was far more effective and sustainable than, any kind of standardized approach.
This story really highlights how Metis isn't, some folksy wisdom, from a bygone era.
Right.
It's a dynamic form of knowledge that's relevant even in, our technologically advanced world.
Absolutely.
It makes me think of permaculture principles,
Yes.
where you're emphasizing working with natural systems rather than against them.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
Permaculture, with its, focus on observation, adaptation, and local knowledge, really embodies so many aspects of Metis.
Right.
And just like Metis's ant solution, permaculture offers these, really innovative approaches to contemporary challenges.
So this begs the question, how do we design institutions, especially in the realm of urban planning,
Yeah.
that are more Metis friendly?
Right.
How do we create systems that actually value and incorporate this kind of practical knowledge?
It requires a real fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of viewing residents as these passive recipients of, top-down planning decisions, we need to see them as active participants, as partners in the design process. Their lived experiences, their understanding of local needs and challenges, these are invaluable resources.
So it's about moving away from that we know best mentality
Totally.
and embracing a more collaborative approach
Yes.
where the expertise of residents is valued and integrated.
Precisely. Instead of imposing those predetermined solutions, a Metis-friendly approach would involve creating frameworks
Uh-huh.
that allow for adaptation and evolution based on local input.
Okay.
Think of it as designing for adaptability rather than rigidity.
So I can see how this would apply to, like the design of public spaces.
Right.
Instead of these, sterile monolithic plazas,
Yeah.
we could create more adaptable spaces that can evolve organically
Right.
based on how people actually use them.
That's a great example. Think about those vibrant public markets that emerge organically, or even those, seemingly insignificant park benches that become these neighborhood gathering spots. These are expressions of Metis,
Yeah.
of people adapting their environment to meet their social and cultural needs.
It reminds me of Jane Jacobs's work,
Yes.
where she argued for, those mixed-use neighborhoods
Yeah.
that foster diversity and interaction.
Right.
Those spaces are constantly evolving, adapting to the needs and desires of the community.
Exactly. Jacobs was such a strong advocate for, the melodies of urban life,
Right.
that wisdom embedded in those everyday interactions and adaptations of city dwellers.
So it seems that, a crucial aspect of designing these Metis-friendly institutions is recognizing that complexity isn't something to be feared or eliminated,
Right.
but rather, embraced and harnessed.
Absolutely. And this applies to more than just, the physical design of cities.
Okay.
The Metis-friendly institution would also foster a culture of experimentation, and learning from mistakes.
Right.
It wouldn't be afraid to try new things, to adapt to changing circumstances, to incorporate the feedback of those working on the ground.
So this sounds a lot like what some people call, institutional evolution.
Yeah.
The idea that systems should constantly adapt and improve based on real-world experience.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Scott's work aligns, really well with this idea of embracing a more, dynamic evolutionary approach to institutional design,
Yeah.
moving away from those rigid structures towards systems that can learn and adapt.
This makes me wonder if Scott has any thoughts on, specific examples of institutions or projects
Yeah.
that embody this Metis-friendly
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah.
Are there any real-world case studies that we can learn from?
Scott actually uses a really interesting example, the Vietnam War Memorial.
Okay.
Unlike, traditional monolithic monuments that impose like a singular interpretation,
Right.
the Vietnam War Memorial, with its simple, evocative design, it invites visitors to bring their own personal meanings to the site.
It's like that openness, that lack of a prescribed narrative,
Right,
actually
yeah.
amplifies the emotional power of the memorial.
Yeah.
It becomes this canvas for individual expression and collective memory.
Precisely. And in doing so, it fosters a sense of participation and emotional connection that really resonates with people.
Yeah.
And Scott sees this as a powerful argument for designing institutions that are similarly open and adaptable.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It just, yeah.
You think that, a more structured, controlled approach would lead to a more powerful outcome.
Right.
But the Vietnam War Memorial shows us that, sometimes leaving space for individual interpretation and engagement
Yeah,
can be far more impactful.
exactly. And this principle extends beyond memorials.
Right.
Think about how we design public parks, community centers, even government services.
Right.
Are we creating spaces and systems that are open and adaptable enough to incorporate those diverse needs and experiences, of the people they serve?
So this brings us to a crucial question. How do we measure the success of these Metis-friendly institutions
Right.
if it's not just about, efficiency or output?
Yeah.
What are the criteria for evaluating, whether we're moving in the right direction?
That's a great question, and it's one that we'll explore further in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll examine how to evaluate institutions based on, their ability to cultivate melodists,
Okay.
to create environments where, practical knowledge and experience are valued and leveraged for positive change.
I'm really looking forward to that discussion.
Me too.
We've covered so much ground already,
Yeah.
but it feels like we're just scratching the surface of this fascinating topic.
There you go.
So let's take a short break to gather our thoughts.
Okay.
And when we come back, we'll delve deeper into the practical implications of designing Melodist-friendly institutions, for a better future.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we're, wrapping up our exploration of Melodist at that practical wisdom that James C. Scott, argues is just so crucial
Yeah.
for navigating complexity. We've explored how ignoring it leads to those thin simplifications
Right.
that ultimately backfire.
And how incorporating that local knowledge
Right.
can lead to, more resilient and effective solutions.
Correct.
So now the question becomes, how do we actually design institutions, systems,
Yeah.
even whole cities
Right.
that are more Mythalaeus friendly?
Right.
How do we move beyond just recognizing the value of it
Yeah.
to actually embedding it in the way things work?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Right, because it's one thing to say, listen to the locals,
Right.
but it's quite another to actually build that into, the DNA of how decisions are made,
Yeah.
especially in urban planning, where you've got, so many stakeholders and regulations and often a very top-down approach.
Totally. You're hitting on a key point there.
Yeah.
Scott argues that Metis-friendly institutions are really marked by two core traits,
Okay.
diversity and adaptability.
Okay.
Think back to that contrast between scientific forestry and a natural, old-growth forest.
Right. The monoculture plantations were efficient on paper, but they lacked that resilience.
Of a diverse ecosystem.
Yeah.
They were vulnerable in a way that the more complex, messy forest wasn't.
Precisely. And that principle applies to human systems as well,
Okay.
So imagine a city designed with this in mind, instead of strict zoning that separates everything, you have those, vibrant mixed-use neighborhoods that Jane Jacobs championed.
Right, where you've got residential, commercial, even light industrial, all rubbing shoulders,
Exactly.
creating that buzz and those chance encounters
Yeah.
that spark innovation.
That's diversity in action,
Right.
fostering a more dynamic environment where adaptation can kind of happen organically.
Yeah, and it's not just about the physical layout either, right?
Yeah.
A Metis-friendly institution would also encourage experimentation,
Yeah.
a willingness to try things out and learn from what works.
And what doesn't.
Right, and what doesn't.
Right,
and
right.
and crucially, valuing the feedback of those on the ground.
Yeah.
Those whose monetis comes from, actually living with the consequences of decisions made, higher up.
Exactly. And, Scott doesn't offer like a simple checklist for
Right.
creating such institutions.
Yeah.
But he does argue that we need to kind of shift our evaluation criteria.
Okay, so not just measuring success by, those traditional metrics like efficiency or output,
Right.
but something more nuanced.
Right. Think about it. How do we judge if a system is truly cultivating monetis?
Yeah.
Maybe it's about how well it facilitates, the sharing of practical knowledge,
Uh-huh.
how much it empowers, those with local expertise, or even its capacity for adaptation over time.
This makes me think about those, community-based design projects
Yeah.
where residents are actively involved in shaping, public spaces.
Right.
You're not just, imposing a predetermined plan,
Yeah.
but you're co-creating with those who will actually use it.
Yeah.
And that feels very Metis-friendly to me.
It is, and it highlights another key point. Successful Metis-friendly institutions often arise from a spirit of genuine collaboration,
Okay.
not just top-down directives.
So it's about a shift in mindset,
Yes.
not just a change in procedures.
Exactly. And that's perhaps, Scott's most challenging but also most hopeful point.
Okay.
We can design structures and processes that encourage Metis, but ultimately it's about fostering a culture where that type of knowledge is valued and sought out.
This has been such an incredible deep dive.
It has.
We've explored how those thin simplifications can backfire,
Yeah.
how Metis offers a different way of knowing and the challenges of designing institutions that truly harness its power.
It's a big topic.
But what does this all mean for our listeners, those urban theorists and planning enthusiasts out there
Right.
who are eager to put these ideas into practice?
Well, Scott's work is a real call to action.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that real progress often emerges from the ground up, from those, small adaptations and innovations rooted in local knowledge.
Okay.
It's about shifting our perspective from viewing complexity as a problem to be solved
Right.
to seeing it as a source of resilience and opportunity.
So as we conclude this deep dive,
Well-
we challenge you, dear listener, to consider,
Yeah.
where do you see that tension between mustatus and formal knowledge playing out
Well-
in your community,
Yeah,
even in your own life?
absolutely.
How can you become an advocate for mustatus, for that practical wisdom that so often gets overlooked?
Such a good question.
Because ultimately, as Scott reminds us, the future is shaped not just by grand plans,
Right.
but by those countless acts of adaptation and ingenuity and collaboration
Yeah.
that emerge from the ground up.
That's it. That's the key.